This is a quick walkthrough of the recent changes to the Educational Evaluation Report feature of the Indiana IEP. The feature is now live in the system, and you can log into your own account and follow along with some of these processes so that you can see them, or just watch the video and refer back as needed to clarify any of the new steps. You can see that the workspace looks pretty similar as far as the overall navigation system. I've logged in on a fake student, Potholes Go Away, just to demonstrate some of these processes. I'm going to show you a couple of the key changes as we go through this. I'm going to start by going into pre-conference planning. In pre-conference planning, you'll see that the 4 options are still the same as they have been before: type of evaluation, existing data, referral decision, and eligibility categories and assessment. Under the tab for eligibility categories and assessment, when you click on that, most of the same options are there, but there are a couple of key differences. At the very top of the page, you'll see a drop-down box to indicate if the student is an English language learner. This is just a place for you to indicate this right from the beginning. And if you say yes to this, then a couple of things will open up. Language information will be part of the assessment options. This won't be automatically checked if you have a student that you've answered no, they do not have English as a second language. They're not an English language learner. Another change to this section, you can see a few additional options here at the bottom that are all optional. One of these is testing observations, in case you want a separate section to put just the observations from when you're working with students. Behavior interventions and progress, as well as language proficiency. That may be something that you also want to indicate for a student who is an English language learner, or potentially for a student who is a younger student and maybe hasn't developed much language yet. Okay, now I'm going to go into the evaluation process. Again, the options that you see here are exactly the same as they were before. Some of the changes, though, are going to be on the assessment data page. So I'm going to pull this page open, and you'll see right from the beginning that this looks a little bit different. One of the differences is at the top of the page, the evaluation start date. So this is actually when the evaluation began. This is not a date that is going to trigger any kind of timeline, but instead this just allows you to see from the moment that we got the evaluation consent, when did we start acting on it? When did we start the evaluation process? Now, don't get too hung up on which date you're using, how you're determining this date. The key is to make sure that your team and your school and your corporation get some consistency about how they're going to determine this date. So for one district, they may decide that it's not until we have face-to-face testing with the student. Another district may determine that the evaluation began the moment any sort of rating scale or form was completed. So maybe it's when the social and developmental history was completed by the parent. It really doesn't matter. The idea is just that you can track kind of the scope of the evaluation from start to finish, as well as this is a feature that could be searched through advanced reporting to help your district administrators determine if there are some issues with maybe waiting too long to start an evaluation, and maybe that's contributing to missing some deadlines. Or maybe we are doing a great job and we can see from advanced reporting that we're starting the evaluations very early on. So either way, determine what you're going to use for that date and indicate the date that the evaluation began. This will print on the report. And this is really the only date that prints on the report unless it's been typed into a specific text box. Next, the multidisciplinary team members are listed, as well as license numbers if they are entered. These are still optional to enter. Before, these were entered at the bottom of the page, and now they appear towards the top, as well as any additional team members that were added. The referral information is still contained as far as the reason for referral. This is not pre-filled by anything else in the system. This has to be typed in manually to determine what that reason for the evaluation is. Now, prior to this, there were multiple boxes that were determined by the consent form that indicated every assessment domain area that had been requested. Each of these buttons were listed, and if you remember, we had to open them up and indicate an assessment, add assessments in, and then you had several different text boxes to enter for each one. This has been streamlined quite a bit, as well as a feature allowing you to be able to enter data tables. This will open up to a screen that allows you to add specific assessments and enter the information for those assessments. You can enter up to 5 different instruments at a time, as well as up to 5 custom instruments that are not already entered into IEP. We've entered over 300 different assessment instruments based on commonly used instruments across different disciplines with the input of a lot of different professionals around the state. But of course, we don't have everything in there, and some things you may use in your district that are custom created for your district or your population. We do ask, though, that as you use the evaluation report feature, if there are particular tests that you use regularly that have not been included in our list, please let us know, and we'll try to periodically update the list, add new information, remove outdated tests, and add those things that have been missed. So I'll show you how this works. First, you identify a particular instrument. You click on the drop-down menu, and again, there are over 300 different assessments of various types that are listed in the drop-down. You can either scroll down and find the list from the alphabetical list, or you can begin typing. So I'm going to enter a KTEA, so I'm going to start typing Kaufman. And it's going to shoot me right to the K's. And then I'm going to scroll down a little bit because, of course, Kaufman has a lot of tests. And I'm going to indicate I want the KTEA 3. Now I have to select the particular assessment domain that the KTEA 3 is assessing. So I know that I've used it specifically for current academic achievement. We have some tests that cross different areas, and so we didn't want the system to be able to identify that for you. We as professionals need to identify what we've used that particular instrument for. Again, you can identify multiple different kinds of instruments at once, and then actually you can click Save and add more if you want to go ahead and set up kind of the framework or the shell for multiple assessments that you've done, or you can do them one at a time. So in this case, I'm going to add in the KTEA. I'm also going to add in a social and developmental history. Now, it doesn't matter if I start by the assessment domain or start by the instrument. So in this case, I'm going to go to the domain category, social and developmental history, but I don't really have a test for that. So in this case, I know I've collected the information, and I'm going to use the first option on the list, which says enter findings for this domain, no assessment instruments or data tables. And then I'm also going to add a third assessment just so that you can see what this looks like under Custom Assessment Instrument. So I'm going to use the IEPRC Spectacular Assessment. And I know that our Spectacular Assessment is specifically something that we use for adaptive behavior. Okay. Now at this point, I'm going to click Save and Continue because I just want to enter the information right now for these 3 assessments. And here's what you'll see on your screen. I have 3 different places that I can enter information. So the first is my social and developmental history. There are no subtests listed for this because it's not an instrument. It's not something that has subtests or composites, so it's not in our system pre-populated by any kind of information. I have the Spectacular Assessment, but I'm the only one who knows about this assessment because it's something custom, and so nothing is listed in that, but there are places for me to add in some specific information. And then I have the KTEA 3, and the system already knows all the available composites, subtests, cluster scores, anything that's associated with the KTEA 3. Okay, so I'm going to start with the KTEA 3. And the first thing that we can do, you'll notice there's a column along the left, and that's just where you can click if you wanted to delete an assessment. There's also a position, which really isn't going to do anything for you at this point. It may rearrange how you see things on a page, but it won't rearrange anything on a report. So my advice is just to not do anything in that column. There is a place for an assessment date. However, this date does not appear on your report. It is important to put the assessment date in though, just so that in the future, if you're reevaluating a student, this information will remain in the system until you remove it. And you want to make sure that you know whether something is current or from a previous assessment. Okay, so again, I'm going to start down with the KTEA, and I'm going to enter a date using the calendar, and let's say that we did this assessment on June 1st. Then I'm going to identify what do I want to show up in a table, a data table. So maybe I only use this specifically for some reading assessment. So I did decoding fluency. I did letter naming facility, letter word recognition. I want the reading composite. I want reading comprehension. Let's say that that's all we did specifically with using the KTEA. Now, if you gave every assessment, that's fine. You can list every assessment, again, that you want to have a space to put a score. Then I identify which types of scores I would like to have in my data table. So I like to use standard scores and percentiles and descriptive classification. I can go ahead and click Save here, and this will set up my data table and have it ready for me. And I'll know it's ready because my Save button has turned into a button that says Details. Now I can go ahead and enter my information for the other assessments at this time or set up the tables, or I can go ahead and click Details now, which I'm going to go ahead and do, and enter the information. So in this case, I've asked for standard scores and percentiles and descriptive classification, and so I can enter the information as appropriate for each of these. Now, if you have particular subtests that maybe have differences in scores within a test. So maybe my subtests in the test have scaled scores or T-scores, and then my clusters or composites have standard scores. That's okay. You ask for both to be in your data table if you want to report those scores. And then when it comes time to enter, you only enter the appropriate ones. Anything that you leave blank will result in a not applicable being printed in that column on the data table later, and I'll show you an example of that when we get to the report. So I enter all the information that I wanted to have for this test, and then I will also put any of my narrative or summary in this box. When I'm done, I click Save and Continue, and I'm back to this page. So let's go up to our social and developmental history. We'll enter a date for that as well. We don't have subtests or composites. And in this case, I don't have any scores either. There are no scores associated with this. So I'm going to click No Score Type, Text Results, and click Save. What that tells the system is that I don't need a table created. I just need a text box to type in. So when I click on Details, that's all I get is a text box. This one already has some information in it, but I would type any of my evaluation results and findings for the social and developmental history in this section. Click Save and Continue, and again you're back to the screen for assessments. Now finally, if you're creating a custom assessment, we've put in the IEPRC Spectacular Assessment. In this case, I'm going to have to tell it more about this assessment. So this is an adaptive behavior measure. So my subtests for this happen to be motor, communication, and self-care skills, and then a composite. And in this case, I want standard scores as well as scaled scores because my motor, communication, and self-care have scaled scores. And I'm going to click Save. And when I click the Details button, I can enter this information. So in this case, I have scaled scores for each of my areas. And then for my composite, it's a standard score, so I'm only going to enter what I have. And click Save and Continue. So again, every time there will be a text box to be able to type in information, and you will only have data tables when it's appropriate for that particular instrument. I'm going to click Save and Continue, and of course you get the nice box that tells you all of the pieces and parts that were required based on the consent form that we've not yet entered. And that's okay. This is a good reminder to say we need to have additional information entered before we can finalize this information. So I'm going to go back to the Add Assessment page. You can enter additional assessments at any time. Click back here to take us back here because I want to show you. You can also click the button that says Edit Details for all instruments. And when you do, you get, this is duplicating this right now just because it's still in this is prior to the launch, so it's a little bit of a testing phase, but it will open up only the data table boxes for any instrument that's in the list. Now, when you're working in a team, you may have multiple people who have entered assessment pieces, and you notice that we can actually edit each other's information if needed. There are no names associated with each instrument, other than if you enter your name as someone who administered the assessment within the text box. So if you entered that John Smith administered the KTEA on this date, then it will appear in the report. If not, your name will not actually be associated with a particular part, because this is a multidisciplinary evaluation. This is not an individual person's evaluation of the student. Okay, again, I'm going to click Save and Continue, and it's taking me back to this page. I'm going to go back to Evaluation Process and Assessment Data again. And again, this is the button, Add Domain Findings and Data Tables, that will take you to each of those pieces. But we know that after each of the assessment domain areas have been covered and all the information is put together, there has to be a synthesized summary of everything that we did. We have to pull it all together and make sense of it for the student. Two other new features that are very important to know about are two new optional features. One is the evaluation findings aligned to characteristics of autism spectrum disorder. Now, this is something that's been in the revision of Article 7 since 2008, but it's not been something that all districts are doing in the same way. So we know that we have to align our findings with the current characteristics of autism spectrum disorder in whatever the current version of the DSM is at the time. In order to do that, some of us are doing it in different ways in how we write our reports, but we wanted to give districts an option to be able to systematically link everything back together on a single document. So you can create this, and you can also identify then, should this be part of the report document when it prints, yes or no. So I'm going to click on Create or Review ASD Alignment and show you what this looks like. So for each of the areas related to the diagnosis of an autism spectrum disorder, so the first one is persistent deficits in social communication and social interactions across multiple contexts. There are several different pieces to that. So for each of those, it just provides us a place to document specific examples of those deficits that we're looking for. It's also a place for you to document those non-examples. If the overwhelming information you have does not support an autism spectrum disorder, it's important to document that as well. So for each of these general areas in the diagnosis, you enter your information and then determine, is there sufficient evidence of this particular characteristic, yes or no? And then you go on to the next characteristic and document all those pieces and parts, and then determine yes or no as far as having sufficient evidence. Then there are questions about whether or not symptoms were present in the early developmental period, whether the symptoms cause clinically significant impairment in different areas, and whether or not those symptoms are not better explained by a few other disability areas. So we have to be able to identify that we've got enough information in each of those areas where we say yes or no in order to determine that this is an autism spectrum disorder. At any time you can create this or view this as a PDF. So we don't have much information in here right now, but if I click on this to see it as a PDF, you can see what the document is going to look like. It's just charted out with specific examples of all these different characteristics. Okay. The other part of Article 7 that talks about very specific criteria for evaluation reports is the SLD certification. And this is something that a lot of districts are struggling to do. There are a lot of very specific requirements when we consider specific learning disability as an eligibility area, and all of these different things are required to be part of the educational evaluation report. Many districts are doing this, but not as part of the report. They're doing it during the case conference, which is a different team. We have a multidisciplinary team, and then we have the case conference committee. And they're two different teams operating at two different times. They may contain a lot of the same people, but it's a separate process. So the law says that this SLD certification and having the members of the multidisciplinary team come together and determine that they have sufficient evidence or not for SLD eligibility has to be part of the report that is available prior to the case conference. So again, you can do that in your report in another way, or you can use the SLD certification in the system, and you can document yes or no as to whether or not you'd like this to be part of the larger educational evaluation report. So when I click on this, it's a very quick form. First, we have to determine, and these are all straight out of Article 7, whether there's evidence of inadequate academic achievement, yes or no. Evidence of insufficient progress or a pattern of strength or weakness relative to a learning disability. Again, districts can choose which SLD indicator they're using, which method for determining SLD eligibility. And again, they just mark yes or no. Evidence of the following as primary reasons for the difficulties that the student is having. So if you've been able to rule out the exclusionary factors as primary reasons for the difficulty, we would mark no. Evidence of adverse educational performance. And then overall, based on everything, does the team determine that there is enough evidence for SLD eligibility? And if we say yes, we have to identify particular areas that the student is struggling in. This is a specific learning disability, not a general learning disability. Okay, so again, you can view that as a PDF, but it's basic information. Now, backup information for each of these questions that you've marked yes or no do need to be fully explained in the body of the report. This is just a nice way to pull this all together. Now, when this is used, this will, and used as part of the report, this will pull in information from your multidisciplinary team so that at the bottom your team members will be listed. There'll be a place for each team member to sign and indicate whether they agree or disagree with the opinion that was stated. And remember, if you disagree, the expectation is you have to submit a written opinion about why it is that you disagree. And this is also going to be printed as an easy fax, so it can be faxed into the system and connected with the student. So now back on the assessment information or assessment data page, again, you can create draft and final reports in the same way that you had before. When I click on a draft of the report, this has additional information that's been entered for this student so that you can see some different ways that the information will pull together and look. The report will look pretty dramatically different than it has in the past. The first thing you might notice is we've got more basic information about the student that wasn't included on previous types of evaluation reports. So we have some information that's come from the system about the students' parents and their school and their grade. Again, lots of this information was not included on the previous report version. Reason for referral will still be the same. The background information section clusters some of the information from the report that's related to the student's background. Now, previously the report was pretty alphabetical, and some of the order of the information didn't make a lot of sense. So now information is clustered in a way that seems to be agreeable across different disciplines and across a lot of different professionals who gave input to these changes. So we've got the social and developmental history, any medical and mental health information. Sometimes there's some other questionnaires that might be included. The observations section will contain any kind of observations that are made. So if we had an observation in the learning environment, a systematic observation, if we had an observation by an SLP, testing observations, all of that will be contained in this section and pulled together. Prior interventions and progress. If you've entered any curriculum-based measures that are part of that progress and interventions domain, it will be pulled into this section as well. Then all other information is included under evaluation findings. So this information is ordered in a particular order based on information from the Educational Evaluation Work Group, who had to kind of come to terms to what would be the most appropriate order to include this information. So we have academic information, communication information, behavioral information, and so on. So I'm going to scroll down to the end. We have our synthesized summary and conclusions that have been typed in, the team members. And then for this particular student, we asked that the Sld certification be included. So you can see that this information just gets tacked right onto the end of the report. And then just for demonstration purposes, we also included the ASD alignment sheet. And that takes you right to the end of the report. So the signature pages will come prior to the Sld certification as well as the ASD alignment sheet if either of those is included. And those will only be options for students who are being evaluated for SLD or autism spectrum disorder. So we hope that the changes to the educational evaluation report feature make this more user-friendly, make our reports a more professional, usable report that can be used across disciplines to help support students. If you have additional questions, you can always contact the IEP Resource Center by using info@indianaiepRC.org.